B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, June 19th, 2019. Happy Juneteenth. Although it's not that happy of a day, I guess. And I continue to remind you that I'll be here through the end of this week, and then I'm embarking on a 3-week hiatus. Foreign adventures are calling me, and I will resume podcasting on Monday, July 15th. So we are girding for what could be a major military confrontation with Iran. And we are seeing Mike Pompeo take the driver's seat here. He's a West Point graduate. He spent a year at the CIA. Then Trump made him Secretary of State. And because he's been shuffling acting secretaries at the Pentagon, Pompeo is the senior guy. And he does appear to be calling the shots and driving this bus, serving the interests of Israel to confront Iran. And Caitlin Johnstone, the scrappy commentator from Australia, who I guess never sleeps. I woke up this morning and picked up her report. And she had been browsing at English language Israeli publications. And the Jerusalem Post is reporting that diplomatic sources at the United Nations are assessing a U.S. plan to conduct a massive airstrike on an Iranian facility linked to its nuclear program in response to the alleged attacks on the tankers in the Gulf of Oman last week. Now, this is a rush to war, I guess, to try to avoid having any close scrutiny of the evidence that's being used to drive it. Jerusalem Post says, the sources added that Trump himself is not enthusiastic about a military move against Iran, but he lost his patience on the matter and will grant Secretary of State Pompeo, who's pushing for action, what he wants. And, you know, Trump is this guy who presents this big image as the guy who is the leader, the micromanager of everything. But we've seen that he's authorized the spooks to invade the power grid in Russia, and they don't need his authority to do that. He allows commanders in the field to call drone strikes now. Obama used to control those very carefully from the White House. And he appears willing to delegate quite a bit when it comes to foreign policy and the military. Johnstone writes, if the U.S. does decide to attack Iran over the highly suspicious Gulf of Oman allegations, it's not difficult to imagine a scenario in which Iran defends itself or retaliates and kills American servicemen. Once you've got the names and faces of U.S. personnel blaring on news screens all across America, you'll see the war hawks converge and demand far more aggressive retaliations against Iran. And if the pressure works, we could easily see an all-out war between the two nations, even before I get back from vacation. Here's another quote from Trita Parsi, a man I've interviewed. He is an Iranian-American at Georgetown. And he says, this is essentially saying that Iran is no different from Syria. You can strike, yet they won't have the guts to respond. We actually know that that's not true, because just 2 weeks ago, when there was ratcheting up with tensions, the U.S. intelligence itself picked up that as U.S. warships were heading toward the Middle East, the Iranians started putting some of their missiles on boats and moving them around. So the idea is that there will just be a limited strike and the Iranians won't respond seems extremely unlikely. But this is how you sell a big war. You pretend that you're selling a small war, because that's more digestible. Well, I have indigestion already. And Johnstone notes that some war critics, like Moon of Alabama and former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, actually believe that Iran is responsible for those brushbacks. I mean, they didn't sink the ships, and they could have, if actually this was caused by Iran. And so this is a very dicey and delicate situation. The United States is the aggressor here. We pulled out of the Iranian nuclear agreement. We impose sanctions. We have tried to put pressure on other countries to honor our sanctions against Iran, as off-base as they are. And Johnstone, who has a sharp kind of class consciousness, writes, "The real truth is that there's an ever-growing, globe-spanning, oligarch-run power alliance with the United States at its center, an alliance which functions as a single empire and works relentlessly to bully other nations into either joining it or collapsing. Iran is by far the strongest nation in the region that's refused to allow itself to be absorbed into the blob, so its government has found itself in the imperial crosshairs, being commanded to either submit or be toppled." Well, I think that's an interesting and caustic perspective. Now to the nuts and bolts, the mechanisms. There is a serious question about whether Trump has the authority to launch any military attack against Iran because we haven't been attacked. Those ships in the Gulf are not ours. And so there is no linkage. And they are struggling to create it. And Mike Pompeo has been trotting on the Sunday talk shows and in congressional testimony, trying to create links that don't exist between al-Qaeda and Iran. Now, why would he do that? It's because of the blank check that Congress issued to George W. Bush after 9/11, the AUMF, Authorization for Use of Military Force, that was so broadly written that it basically said al-Qaeda and anybody else we want to claim is linked to al-Qaeda. And so the evidence is so flimsy of connections between Iran and al-Qaeda as to be insulting. And I was pleased to see Tim Kaine, who I found to be a kind of nothing burger when he was running as Hillary's vice presidential candidate in 2016. He, of course, is a senator from Virginia. And he gave a strong interview on PBS NewsHour last night, flatly opposing military action and saying that it would not be legal. And you may recall that last year, I was critical of the Democrats for recruiting spooks to run for Congress. And one of them who got elected, a Democrat from Michigan and a former CIA agent, Alyssa Slotkin, well, she's actually been challenging Pompeo on this. She worked in Iraq. She's a former CIA analyst and Pentagon official. And she said any of us working on national security should be looking at any talk of ties between senior Iranian leaders and al-Qaeda with a real skeptical eye. How about calling it bullshit, Congresswoman Slotkin? Because the only claim they can make is that after 9/11, there were about a dozen al-Qaeda members who fled from Afghanistan when the bombing started, and they landed in Iran. And there's no indication that they ran a network or other operations from there. They were just given safe harbor. And if that is the basis to link al-Qaeda with Iran, oh, we're in deep trouble. Now, I am pleased to see that members of both parties have joined Tim Kaine. Mike Lee of Utah, Rand Paul of Kentucky are two Republicans, and they shared a letter saying Congress has not authorized war with Iran, and no current statutory authority allows the U.S. to conduct hostilities against the government of Iran. We need more of that, a whole lot more, and fast. Meanwhile, European leaders in Britain, France, and Germany are mounting a last-ditch effort to dissuade Iran from effectively bailing from the nuclear deal. But what is the point? If the U.S. muscles those allies into compliance with our unilateral sanctions, they are caught between the United States and Iran. And even if the Europeans don't believe the flimsy evidence that we have offered about Iran's responsibility for last week's attempted attacks on these tankers, they are in a very difficult position. So we've got Heiko Maas, Germany's foreign minister, the risk of war in the Gulf has not been averted. We need to do everything so that it doesn't come to this. That's why we're talking to all sides. I was in Iran. We're also talking with the Americans. We need to de-escalate through dialogue. It is a time of diplomacy first. And we have a quote from Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran. He told his cabinet, sitting at the negotiating table with someone who continues exerting pressures on the Iranian nation has no meaning but surrendering. If they want negotiation and are sincere, they should pave the ground for it, and that sincerity means removal of all cruel sanctions, respecting the Iranian nation, and accepting the system, he's talking about the system of the Ayatollah and the mullahs, that has risen to power through people voting. And to try to strengthen this flimsy evidence that's being used to blame Iran for the attack on the two tankers, the Pentagon has trotted out Commander Sean Kido, K-I-D-O, a naval explosives expert, and he said that the debris and a magnet that were left behind on the side of the ship bore a, quote, striking resemblance to limpet mines advertised by Iranian forces. A striking resemblance. Now, this is so juvenile. It is cartoonish. Because there's no direct evidence that Iranians put the limpet mine on the side of the ship, and they didn't even follow the instructions because you put it below the waterline if you want to sink the ship. And the American photos of this crew on a small boat removing a mine that didn't explode. I mean, this just reeks of a staged event, a false flag. And the U.S. credibility is shot. It has been since the phony intelligence was used to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And this guy Kido said authorities had recovered a handprint and fingerprints on the ship, which could be used to build a criminal case to hold the individuals responsible. That's as credible as the claim that one of the hijackers' passports survived a fall from the Twin Towers and was found in the debris on the streets of Lower Manhattan. Really, spare me. And let's just take a look back at a year ago, April of 2018, when we were told by the corporate media and by our government that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons in the city of Douma. And so the experts were called in, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and they issued a report essentially affirming the claims of the U.S. government that were buttressed by our media. And since then, a conflicting report that had been suppressed by the OPCW has surfaced. And Aaron Mattei, a young journalist, as you know I have deep respect for, writing at the Gray Zone Project, interviewed Ted Postal, a man I've talked to on many occasions. He is a professor emeritus from MIT, a rocket scientist and expert on chemical and biological weapons. And he accuses the head of the OPCW of badly mischaracterizing his report and in suppressing the conflicting report. And Mattei goes through some of the history of what we know about the event, and then goes to some of the critical commentary that surfaced in Ian Henderson's finding. He works for the OPCW, and it was his report that was suppressed. And Postal says, quote, unlike the claims made by Ambassador Arias, that's the head of the OPCW, the leaked internal engineering completely undermined the findings of his report to the UN Security Council about two alleged chlorine cylinder attacks on April 7, 2018 in Douma. The leaked document provided unambiguous contradictory data from the UN fact-finding mission supporting technical analysis that explicitly showed the attacks were staged. And so we have to work with the probability that the U.S. or Israel staged this attack on the on the tankers in the Gulf of Oman in order to blame the Iranians. And until that is thoroughly investigated and we can dispel that, my suspicions outweigh any of the so-called evidence. Even Adam Schiff's claims that he's seen intelligence that convinced him. We're learning more about Mark Esper, the former lobbyist for Raytheon, guy who was part of a conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. He's a graduate of West Point, and he only got about an hour or two notice that he was going to be elevated to acting defense secretary when Mike Shanahan pulled out on Monday. And Esper served, first of all, he was at West Point, a classmate of, get this, Mike Pompeo. Then he served in the Army, served in Iraq. He joined the Heritage Foundation. Then he went through the revolving door, jobs on Capitol Hill, the Pentagon, then wound up at Raytheon. Then he went through the revolving door again to become the Secretary of the Army. And they gave him a phone call only an hour or two before Trump tweeted that Mike Shanahan, was resigning on Monday. And so here is an unproven, unknown guy who is running the Pentagon at a time that Trump appears to be trying to visit shock and awe on the leaders in Iran. It is mind-boggling. And what will the new Secretary of Defense acting Mark Esper have to say about the Saudis? Because a new UN report concludes that Jamal Khashoggi, was the victim of a deliberate, premeditated execution, an extrajudicial killing for which the state of Saudi Arabia is responsible under international human rights law. And they concluded, based on the recordings, and we can seriously conclude that Turkey had bugged the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And when Khashoggi showed up there last October, the audio recordings indicate that he was injected with a sedative, suffocated with a plastic bag, and then they dismembered his body. And they even provide some direct verbatim quotes from transcripts of the wiretap of the consulate. And it shows that the day before the event, the staff was told a commission is coming from Saudi Arabia tomorrow. They have something to do in the consulate. Their work will take 2 or 3 days. Then there was discussion about a farmhouse in a city on the coast of the Sea of Marmara and its isolated position. Somebody asks, is anybody there? There is nobody there, just a caretaker. Very nice, is the response. Then, shortly after Khashoggi arrived, one Saudi official asked whether it would be possible to put the trunk in a bag. Another replied, no, too heavy. It's not a problem. The body is heavy. First time I cut on the ground. If we take plastic bags and cut into pieces, it'll be finished. We'll wrap each one of them. And they even have the sequence of events. When Khashoggi showed up, he's taken into the consul general's office. And first they threaten him. We have to take you back. There's an order from Interpol. We are coming to get you. He is told to use one of his phones to send a text message, and he refuses. Khashoggi, what should I say? See you soon? I can't say kidnapping. I will not write anything. An official, type it, Mr. Jamal. Hurry up. Help us so we can help you, because at the end, we will take you back to Saudi Arabia, and if you don't help us, you know what will happen at the end. Let this issue find a good end. And then Khashoggi is heard saying, there's a towel here. Are you going to give me drugs? We will anesthetize you, came a reply. And then a struggle can be heard as voices are saying, did he sleep? Keep pushing. Push here. Don't remove your hand. Push it. I suppose that's referring to a syringe. Every day I've been pausing to thank people who have checked in here as we observe the 10th anniversary of the Peter B. Collins podcast. And I wanted to read the full comment of Brian Carey who I mentioned briefly last week among many other comments. He said, I first heard of you on Who, What, Why. I've been listening daily for about a year. I donate monthly. I like your ability to pack a lot of important info into a short time, and I rely on your analysis of events. And you sound like Barry White. Ooh, baby, baby. Yeah, I got all the love you can handle. Well, Barry White or not, I am pleased that so many people have checked in. It's not too late. I'm sure some people are just hearing last week's podcast for the first time. So feel free to send me an email, peter@peterbcollins.com. Let me know how you found the podcast, where you're located, how often you listen, and anything else that you want to mention about your experience with this podcast. And I'd love to hear from you. And I also love to hear from people who want to take out a new subscription. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber, and when we get to the sign-up page, I think you know what to do. Today in the Netherlands, the Dutch-led investigative team that has been looking at the shoot-down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine. That was 5 years ago. They've announced individual indictments of Igor Girkin, a former colonel in the Russian FSB, and Sergei Dubinsky and Oleg Pulatov, both of whom work for the GRU. They've also named a Ukrainian citizen, Leonid Karchenko, and they claim that these people conspired to bring the Buk surface-to-air missile battery into Ukraine long enough to launch the missiles that they claim took out MH17. And I remain very skeptical here. The New York Times article claims that there's more detailed evidence, ever more detailed evidence against the Russian government. In another passage, they say the announcement is the latest development in an already meticulously documented tragedy of the Ukraine war. I don't think we know. And I believe the claims that there were Buk batteries controlled by the military of Ukraine. They had been sold when, after the Cold War, there were peaceful relationships between Russia and Ukraine. And so I welcome proof. If the prosecutors can provide the evidence that is persuasive, I will accept it. But at this point, I remain quite skeptical. There is a great report at Mint Press News today under the byline of Jimmy's Llama. And Jimmy's Llama is described as a female. This is the first time I've seen this byline. An independent researcher and writer currently trying to stay warm in the Midwest, it says. So she does a recap of all the commentary that the UN rapporteur on torture, Niles Melzer, has made about Julian Assange and the way he has been persecuted. And it is a detailed report. I'm not going to quote it at length here for you, but I do want to invite you to read it because it provides, I think, a real comprehensive look at the ways in which Assange has been mistreated, the phony claims coming out of Sweden that really were just a front for an effort by the U.S. to extradite him, and the bottom line, that he is a journalist and that his indictment and extradition under the Espionage Act are way out of bounds. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I think it's an important piece of work that you won't see anywhere in the corporate media. So yesterday I reported that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had correctly called the facilities that we're using to detain migrants on the southern border concentration camps. And I told you how Jonathan Katz, the journalist, had written an op-ed at the LA Times a week ago. We reported it here on the podcast. And the way we are holding people does qualify. But Nancy Pelosi, who said that she wasn't up to date on AOC's comments and hadn't spoken to her about them, gave a warning at a breakfast hosted by the Christian Science Monitor today to her Democratic colleagues. Understand that while the Republicans have no interest in holding the president accountable for his words, they will misrepresent anything that you say, just if you have one word in the sentence that they can exploit. Now, that's not bad advice. But let me read to you from comments made by a panel of appeals court judges in San Francisco yesterday, hearing an appeal from the Trump administration saying that their treatment of unaccompanied minors is in compliance with the 1997 consent decree. And they argued that they are not required to provide minors, in all situations, with sleeping accommodations, toothbrushes, toothpaste, showers, soap, towels, and dry clothes, as long as the facilities are safe and sanitary. That's sanitary. So Judge Wallace Tashima says it's within everybody's common understanding that if you don't have a toothbrush, soap, a blanket, those are not safe and sanitary. One of the other judges on the panel, Marcia Berzin, you're really going to stand up and tell us that not being able to sleep isn't a question of safe and sanitary conditions? And then the third judge, William Fletcher, said no one would argue that this is safe and sanitary. I mean, this is so disgusting that the fundamental needs of any human being for personal hygiene and just basic sleep, they're claiming we don't have to provide that for people. That is a concentration camp. Those are detention standards that fall so far below basic human rights that for a government lawyer to go into an appeals court hearing and say that crap in a straight face, that's insulting to every American. Oh, and Pelosi at that same breakfast was asked again about impeachment and whether she would support censure as a half step. She said, no, I think censure is just a way out. If you're going to go, you've got to go. In other words, if the goods are there, you must impeach. And censure is nice, but it's not commensurate with the violations of the Constitution should we decide that's the way to go. And she said a censure of Trump would be a day at the beach for the president or at his golf club or wherever he goes. This is so convoluted and confounding because she appears to be saying that if you've got the goods, and hey, the goods are there, then you must impeach. And she continues to resist just that. Here in California, I'm once again proud of Governor Gavin Newsom. He surprised me yesterday by issuing a full-throated apology to Native Americans for the genocide they endured here in California. He made the comments at the future site of the California Indian Heritage Center. I am here to say the following. I am sorry on behalf of the state of California. I'm sorry that we've had generations, your kids and grandkids, your ancestors, that had to suffer through the indignities, their lives lost, their lives diminished. And he signed an order creating a Truth and Healing Council, which will collect tribal stories and issue a report by 2025. And it is believed that there were originally as many as 700,000 Native people in California, and today there are 741,000 who identify as American Indian. At a hearing on Capitol Hill, the Judiciary Committee today, there was a discussion about reparations for African Americans over slavery. And this is the legacy of my old buddy John Conyers, who left Congress in disgrace. But year after year, he introduced a bill to require reparation payments to African Americans. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote the 2014 article, The Case for Reparations, called out Mitch McConnell several times by name, citing the senator's comment that he doesn't favor reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible. And Coates said he was alive for the redlining of Chicago and the looting of black homeowners for some $4 billion. Victims of their plunder are very much alive today. I'm sure they would love a word with the majority leader. Also want to recommend there's a good piece, background on reparations, under the byline of James Kidd, available over at Who, What, Why today. A couple of quick stats from the UN. The population of the Earth is currently at 7.7 billion. estimated to increase to $9.7 billion by 2050 and could reach $11 billion by 2100. And contrast those numbers with this. We have now reached a new world record of the number of people who are displaced, refugees both inside their native countries and out. That number has now reached 70 million. And many of those people are on the run because of American actions, starting with the war in Iraq. Oh, yeah, Trump kicked off his 2020 campaign last night with another mob rally, this one in Orlando, and he spewed lies and attacked his opponents and, that kind of stuff. The fact-checkers had a field day with all the lies and misstatements that he said. Let's see, here's the summary from the Times. Standing in front of a sea of people wearing Make America Great Again hats, Trump unleashed a torrent of attacks, falsehoods, exaggerations, and resentments that were the trademark of his first campaign, have been on almost daily display during his time in the White House. And Trump is refusing to acknowledge that he was wrong about the Central Park Five. You know, he took out ads in New York newspapers calling for the death penalty, and Trump never admits an error. And he is true to form in this case. They have paid millions in settlements. A man has admitted that he committed the crime and that these 5 men were framed. And that doesn't matter to Trump. He's using his Charlottesville false equivalency, saying, well, there are people on both sides of that. And referring to the framed men, they admitted their guilt. If you look at Linda Fairstein and if you look at some of the prosecutors, they think the city should never have settled the case. So we'll leave it at that. That shows, really, that he is racist to the core, in my view. Because if he cannot accept the innocence of those men, which has been clearly established, then he prefers to live with the ignorance that promotes his deep-seated bias. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it absolutely everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling